My name is Eric Richter with Digital Media Solutions, and today we're interviewing Reverend James Lawson. And let's just go ahead and get started. Today is October 28th. Thank you very much. October 28th at 12:45 in the p.m. And we're at Alex Haley Farm, at the Maya Angelou Library. Let's just go ahead and get started. You want me to ask, what took you to India to study nonviolence with Gandhi? And when did you return to the United States? And how did you come to teach nonviolence to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference?
Well, first of all, I started reading Gandhi in 1947 as a freshman in college, because I was actively engaged in resisting racism, and I was actively engaged in resisting violence, personal street stuff and whatnot. So I started reading the autobiography of Gandhi. And reading the autobiography where he introduced me to the word nonviolence, I recognized that nonviolence was the term that most represented what I was about and what I wanted to see happen. And as I read Gandhi in college and practiced it personally, I became quite convinced that the Indian experience represented the way for the Negro, which was the term used then, to change the racism, the Jim Crow law, the segregation practices of America. I wanted to go live overseas, and the Methodist Church offered me the opportunity to go to coach in a high school in what is now Zimbabwe. But in the meantime, I had sent my draft cards back, seeing the draft, what was called selective service, also as an unjust law, unfairly practiced. So that meant before I left before I could go to Africa, I was arrested and sent to prison for 3 years in the federal pen.
This was before you went to India?
Before I went to India. The Board of Missions that had hired me to go overseas to work for a 3-year period wrote and said, you're still a part of our personnel. Do you want, since we couldn't get the court to release you to us, go to Africa, do you still consider yourself wanting to do this? And I wrote back and said, yes. So the 52 preparation for sending people out of college overseas was an Asian program where they sent people mostly to teach English across Asia. But there was this college where a Harvard University graduate, PhD graduate, was the president in Nagpur, India, and David Moses wanted to introduce in his college American-style coaching and physical education. And so he heard of my availability through the our Board of Missions, and so I went to India. But I didn't get to go to India until 1953, so I was there from 1953 to 1956. Gandhi was dead, so I did not study with Gandhi. But what I did do was to follow Gandhi's tracks, to go visit some of the sites where he worked, his ashram sites, to visit with people who had been engaged in the movement deeply, especially with members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is an international organization, and many of whom in India support it, the Gandhian independence movement. So I met some of them. I met Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister, on 2 or 3 occasions. So my study was a more informal study. I studied the movement of self-determination and independence on the part of India in an informal fashion with certain goals and targets that I was able to achieve.
Okay. 1 second, let me move this over here just so I can see a little bit better. Make sure. Okay. And when you came back, when did you come back to the United States?
Came back to the United States in August of '56.
August 1956.
Mhm.
And then how did you use what you learned? Briefly, how did you use what you learned at the to teach nonviolence at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference?
Well, so 1957, I was studying nonviolent behavior around the world, actually. In Europe, in the United States, in Africa, elsewhere, in those 10 years. And then with Gandhi as my major, in a sense, my major mentor on it. I had thought from my college days that one day I would be working in the South. And I shook hands with Martin Luther King Jr. on February the 6th, 1957. We had a chance to have a private conversation and a personal conversation for the first time. I was in graduate school in theology at that time. And the net result of that conversation was that Martin King said for me, urged me to come south immediately to help work in the struggle. The emerging nonviolent struggle. That was '57. So I did. I dropped out of Oberlin and moved to Nashville. In the meantime, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, of which I was a member, hired me as a Southern Secretary. So this really worked good because I had to have an income. I was an adult supporting myself. So I had a job, a salary. I landed in Nashville. A major reason for going to Nashville instead of some other place was that Vanderbilt University was in Nashville. It had one of the strongest theological graduate schools of theology in the country, and it was an ecumenical school, which all was attractive to me. So I moved there as my preference that when I went back to my graduate school, Vanderbilt would be available, and it was. So out of that, I started teaching the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Nonviolence and Martin King in January of 1958. I had a first workshop where Martin King was present and was the organizer of it in January of 1958. I was able to teach the Little Rock Nine a lot of the techniques of nonviolence in Little Rock, in and out of there that spring, that winter and spring. So I went to various board meetings, crisis places, people. I met Fred Shuttlesworth at that time, King, C.K. Steele, all of these are people I met in the SCLC network, Kelly Miller Smith. So a part of my work was to advocate and help teach, help people to learn about the power of nonviolent struggle.
Right.
So.
You talked about meeting Dr. King. Now, he was already involved in nonviolent protests at the time, or?
Yes, when we met, I read about King and the Montgomery bus boycott as early as 1955, December, in India. So I knew about it, and I knew who he was, and it followed it from the distance in newspapers, magazines. It was all over the world, all over India especially. So the Montgomery bus boycott had just ended in Nashville when we shook hands and talked. So, but King did not know what the next steps were, nor did anybody else at that period. But there were any number of people who were sure this was something we needed to continue, but just when and how, that was unknown.
Okay. Just describe your involvement with the Freedom Riders and your experience with the early efforts to set a grade to major cities in the South. Now, just briefly, the Freedom Riders were...
That's 1961. The Congress of Racial Equality, led by Jim Farmer, organized a freedom ride of about 16 people who were going to go down the East Coast from Washington, D.C. They began May 4th, I think, and they were to travel on 2 different buses, go to Greyhound Trailway bus stations, and test the waiting rooms, the lunch counters, the restrooms. All of these from Washington, D.C. on would be marked white only, colored only, and so forth. So they were testing it because the Supreme Court had ruled that such signs in interstate travel were unconstitutional. Such an arrangement of segregation was unconstitutional. So they were testing that. I did support the idea, and John Lewis from Nashville became one of those 16 people. I wrote a letter of reference for him to Jim Farmer, because I knew Jim and CORE. And so CORE started that. It was not necessarily supported by everybody, but that's true anyway in a social movement. But anyway, when they reached Alabama, they met the conspiracy, and I'll call it that, though I may not like that word particularly, the conspiracy of the White Citizens Council, the Ku Klux Klan, the local police, and the FBI to let violence stop the ride. So in Anniston, Alabama, a mob followed the bus, disabled all of its tires, stopped it, threw firebombs in it, tried to lock the riders, who were black and white, into the bus. Someone helped to get them out of the bus. They got out of the bus choking, injured by the smoke and the gas, the bomb and fire that the bus was burning. It was stopped only because a state highway trooper, somehow got on the scene, and people were not killed and permanently injured because he shot his gun in the air and said, "Stop it," and the mob backed off. When the riders licked their wounds and then rode the buses to Birmingham, again the same kind of groups gathered. And when the bus rode up to the station in Birmingham, they were met by, again, a screaming, hollering crowd with crowbars and bats and batons and all kinds of things, and rushed to destroy this group of people who got off that bus. There were life injuries at that time, though nobody was killed. In any case, the 13 riders that ended up in Birmingham were so badly bruised and wounded that, and the bus company would not take them any further to Montgomery, that they called it off. We in Nashville, because of our in-depth examination of social struggle, and especially nonviolent social struggle, said to ourselves that if the bus freedom ride is stopped by violence, it might mean the movement will have no place to go from then on. And besides, we said, we have the right of peaceful assembly. So we must not allow the bus ride to cease. And after a long conversation, our campaigns in Nashville said, we're going to take the ride back up. So in one sense, in a way, there were two freedom rides. The one that CORE started, that gave everybody the idea, and then that our Nashville movement, not SNCC, but our Nashville movement picked up and said we must continue. We said that when violence is hurled against us, we have to find a way to walk through it, to go over it, to go around it. We can postpone a campaign, but we must not allow violence to become the way by which a peaceful movement, a nonviolent movement, is going to be stopped. And so that meant then the second phase of the movement, of that campaign, second phase of the Freedom Ride, was initiated by the people of Nashville, students and clergy alike in our organizations, who said we'll pick it up. And so I had Diane Nash, who was chairman of our committee in Nashville, to call Robert Kennedy and tell him, who was Attorney General, that the ride would continue because we were going to continue it with our people. I asked her to call Jim Farmer of CORE and inform him that we were not going to allow the ride to stop. I asked her to call Martin King. And so when the ride went to Birmingham with our people from Nashville on it, again, the ride was met with by a mob in Montgomery. And a lot of people gathered then. The Justice Department had people there of the federal government. Jim Farmer got there. Fred Shuttlesworth was there. Martin King was there. Diane Nash was there. And so after that riot there, we organized a coordinating committee for the Freedom Ride that had all of those elements on that committee, and said we will recruit nationwide. And so that's what happened. We sent out a call for people to come and join the Freedom Ride. And meanwhile, Nashville people went to Montgomery, and a number of us then took the bus again. I was included in that group. We went to Jackson, Mississippi, where we were all arrested at the bus station one way or another. So that then heralds what the Freedom Ride became, so that eventually more than 400 of us served time in Mississippi jails. And then there were different rides from different parts of the country. I had a friend who went on a ride from California to Houston, Texas, and was arrested there and spent time in that jail with other people from Los Angeles. And there were rides in the East Coast and something. So the Freedom Ride became then a kind of a national symbol, and that's how the Freedom Ride. So the Freedom Ride in the second phase. And the Kennedy administration was telling us to stop the Freedom Ride, stop the demonstration. Let us work on this from the legislative. But I maintain that legislative work and all really proceeds better when there are mass movements of people, and where those people are acting as engaged citizens of their own country. We did not get Social Security because academic or legislative people said it's necessary. We got Social Security because working families all across the country were striking in almost every industry. There were thousands of strikes in 1929, 1930, all over in 1931, in 1932, 1933, 1934. And their strikes made the whole nation become aware of the fact we got all kinds of working people who live in poverty.
Right.
And so Social Security was one of the measures that was passed. The right of the worker to collectively bargain was another piece of legislation that was passed. So the rise of a middle class in our nation is misunderstood, but it was because of the striking people, members of my own family in Ohio, who struck the steel mills with their colleagues and got wages and benefits and health care and whatnot. That's what produced the middle class in the United States. It wasn't the banks or Wall Street. So anyway, the Freedom Ride caused the federal government to say that all Americans should be able to travel without hostility directed against them in any one spot or any place, that there should be the freedom of travel for all Americans. And they didn't pass a law. They got the Interstate Commerce Commission to decree that there could be no segregation in interstate travel. Of course, that was the only group that they had that they could make that happen.
How was this enforced in the South?
Well, unfortunately, in that case, there was no enforcement pattern, but local people could then help get it established, and they could help see to it that the signs came down in the airports and the train stations and the bus stations, and that's what happened. NAACP, in fact, which had chapters all over the country, moved to get their chapters to go see whether or not that was being enforced. And they also encouraged black folk who did traveling in one way or another to travel on a desegregated basis. So I don't think there was any governmental enforcement, except maybe where there was a local government who decided that since the law of the land has been passed, we're going to obey it. But that story, has that story been researched? No, not that I know of.
The sanitation
Yeah,
infrastructure
right.
in Memphis and
Well, a part of the heritage of slavery is what I call plantation capitalism in America in the present day, where many, many forms of business decide that a working person doesn't have to have sustainable living wages and or safety or health benefits and the rest, and pension benefits. The sanitation workers were one such group, mostly in many places across the country, but the workers in Memphis, who were all black except for white supervisors, were on food stamps, could not make enough money to do their care for their families and their children. And a fellow by the name of T.O. Jones, who was a sanitation worker, had started organizing 6 years, 1962 that would have been. Before this, he had gotten himself fired as a consequence. The attitude in Memphis was that the workers were city employees, that they could not strike, they could not agitate, could not collectively bargain. They had no rights except the rights that the city gave them. So finally, as I say, they started organizing in 62. In February of 68, two men sitting out a rainstorm in the back of one of their trucks, the mechanism went off and they were crushed to death. Their families had no benefits, not even for burial. And so that so angered the men, because the condition of the trucks was one of the issues that they raised. The lack of sanitary conditions in the forgotten what they called the big, maybe houses or big plants where they went to work out, from which they worked and all of that. So the death of these two colleagues pushed them to walk off the job and declare a strike.
And then you did, was it you that got that contacted Dr. King and getting him to come in and help with this in March?
Well, the workers thought that the city government could settle it, but there was a mayor in place as of 1967 who was adamant that they had to go back to work, and then he would talk with them, stuff like that. And though business people and pastors in the city and other citizens tried to press him and the city council to do something about it, negotiate and get it done, this could not happen, did not happen. So February 23rd, we had pushed the city council in such a fashion that the city council decided to write a letter of agreement with the workers that would acknowledge them as a union, and the mayor vetoed it. And the city council decided as a whole that they had to leave it in the hands of the mayor. And we were quite upset by this decision because the city council had promised a week before that they were going to settle it. So in order to direct the anger that was in the civic auditorium when this was announced, we organized quickly a march down Main Street from the civic auditorium, and we got the permission of the Commission on Fire and Police to do this. The international union leaders who had arrived in town for the negotiations and all, and our local people agreed we would have this peaceful march. They were mostly the workers, but there were many of us, like myself, in the march. We started out from the civic auditorium. It was to be a nonviolent march because that was our creed, our determination of the workers. Suddenly, out of the side streets appeared patrol cars packed with officers, police officers. Down the road, as we walked, they pushed their cars up against us. Then suddenly, they poured out of their cars with gas cans and maced us up and down the line and broke up the march. They targeted some people. They arrested a handful of people. The media, the newspapers said that we were unruly, which is a lie. In any case, when that happened, we arrived at Mason Temple Church, which is a Church of God in Christ, and many phone calls were made, and people came from around the city very angry with this grotesque misbehavior on the part of the police. And the decision was made then, we have to mobilize the whole community to back the strike. And so on the spot, I was there for part of the meeting, but I had pastoral things that I felt I had to do. So I left early, but I was named to be one of the members of the strategy committee. And this was a Thursday or Friday evening, I can't remember which for sure, but in any case, I think Friday night when I got home from making hospital calls, I got the call saying that the meeting has asked you to be chair of the strategy committee and to get the committee operating and functioning to mobilize the community. So that's how we got a strategy committee, and that's how I was engaged. I had been involved by going to the meetings of the union and speaking to the workers and things of that kind, but was not in any kind of there was no kind of community organization. I met with the labor leaders, but the gassing convinced all kinds of black folk that everybody had to engage in it and help the strike win.
And did you contact, or did you?
So
contact
we met that Monday. I called a strategy committee for that Monday, and immediately we organized for the long haul. And one of the things we organized was mass meetings. And one of the things in that conversation was then that we should invite some people from outside to come in and speak to our mass meetings. So we started our own mass meetings immediately, and local speakers did the speaking. But then in that Monday meeting, we said we want to get Roy Wilkins, who's NAACP president in New York, to get him to come in because the NAACP was actively engaged in supporting the strike in Memphis. So we had a person call him to get him to come. The International Union wanted to bring in a union person to speak, and that was Bayard Rustin. So he was called by the International Union. And the strategy committee said, of course, we must call Martin King and get him in. And so I was asked to call Martin King. So that was done in the late days of February of '68. And as I remember it, Roy Wilkins and Bayard Rustin came in March the 10th for a big mass meeting. 10,000 people, maybe 8,000 people. At the Mason Temple. It was a great meeting. And when I talked to King on behalf of the strike and the community, I did not give him a date because I knew his schedule. We'd been working together by that time since '58. I knew his hectic schedule, and my invitation to him was, he was immediately ready to come. But of course, he said to me, we'll have to find a way of doing it. And when? And so I said, well, you set the date and we'll call the meeting in Memphis. And so he set it for, I think, March the 17th. Eventually, he called me back and said, I can do it this date.
When he came, and the first march, my understanding that there was a march that he attended first, and that ended badly.
Well,
Violence.
there were 3 major marches in Memphis. There were 4 plans of marches in Memphis. February 23rd, I think, was the date when we were all gassed. When King came the 18th, he proposed, why don't we have a day of work stoppage? And the crowd accepted that. But that day of work stoppage, we'll have a march, but everyone stay off from work. We had 24 inches of snow that day. So the Lord did it. So we were walking through the snow that day, the day before, organizing it. So it's the 3rd march where the police planned to break it up and provocateurs. Now, the evidence of that is overwhelming. But much of that evidence was established after the march, though I saw the police in phalanxes of riot gear, all the stuff, across Main Street, up ahead of the march, and I decided that they were going to break us up, so I ordered the march stopped. Didn't order it. I told my marshals who were in the first line, stop, turn around, I'm going to turn the march around. I ran about a block past to Martin in his line. I said, Martin, you have to leave. because I'm turning the march around. The police are going to break us up. He reluctantly left, and then I had a bullhorn, and I stayed where I was and told the marchers to turn around, and we were going back to the church, and we were going back to our homes.
After you convinced Dr. King to leave, I mean,
Yes, right.
you also convinced him to come back, correct?
Well, after that march, in March, in which Dr. King was persuaded to leave, then he got a national static against him as a coward and all that kind of junk. And he knew that would happen because he told me, if I leave, I'll be accused, which is what, even on the Senate floor. Even on the Senate floor, he was accused of being cowardly. And I hated that extra burden on him, but I was acting in the moment too, and I thought that was our best response. But then Martin Luther King Jr. himself was the major impetus for coming back, because he felt he had to demonstrate the possibilities of a nonviolent march. So though many people tried to persuade him not to, he did return, and he and I negotiated a date for another march. That was April the 8th, I think. Yes, I think that was April the 8th. And so he had come into March, he had come into Memphis on the 3rd to help solidify the decisions, but also because we had taken the city to the federal court to challenge the injunction against us locally. And he was included in the injunction that the city won in a city court and all. So he came in to also help guide the strategy in the court case, asking the federal court to modify the injunction by the city. So that is the essence of it, I think.
Okay, and then the night that he died.
Beg pardon?
The night that he died.
Yeah, April the 4th he was assassinated.
So I apologize. Yes, I don't mean to.
Yeah, I know you
make
don't.
it sound
Yeah.
like he just passed away.
Yeah,
Yes,
he was assassinated.
The night he was murdered.
Yeah, he was assassinated. That was April 4th. I'm not sure what to say about that day. He was engaged in day-long conversations on some of the work that he had to do and in the Memphis campaign. At his insistence, I went by the motel early morning before the court to have a final briefing on the court case, to talk about it again. So I did that, went to court. He asked me to come back after court and talk some more about it, which I did. So I saw him somewhere between 2:30 and 4:30 for a couple of hours. We were talking then about the march and the movement in Memphis, as well as about the court case. So I left him about somewhere around 4:30, and went by the movement office to try to do some work there for a bit. But then rushed home close enough to 6, because Dorothy and I had a organizing thing with ourselves and our sons at that time, that no matter where I was in the city, I would be moving back home by 6 for us to eat together the evening meal. So we did that regularly. And so I was home by a few minutes to 6. And was just greeting Dorothy in the kitchen when we both heard over the television that was just outside the dining room announce that someone had been shot. I didn't know what, but I went over to the television set and watched, and the word came over the king had been shot at the Lorraine Motel. So I told Dorothy I asked Dorothy to immediately call station WDIA, which was a station that played music and played across the black community, that I was on my way out there and that I wanted to speak over the radio about the king being shot and about the next day's activities. And so she did that while I jumped back in my car and rushed out there. And my first act on the radio was to say the king had been shot, and then to announce that the march the next morning would occur at 9 o'clock, that the strike would go on, that the economic boycott would go on, and that we would continue to mobilize as a community to support this legitimate effort in which the workers were engaged. So it was talk like that. Then the ticker tape came through and said the king had died. So I announced that and called for calm and called for us continuing the movement, that that's what King would want us to do. And from there I went to another station so that night, after the shooting, I spent the night basically moving from radio station to television station to television station, announcing the march at 9 a.m. and saying that the strike would continue, that we would celebrate King by making the movement effective for the 1,300 workers and their families. So that's how I spent that night.
Okay, how long after did you meet James Earl Ray?
All right, well, I met James Earl Ray probably a good year afterwards. He had been convicted in January, I think, or February. He accepted a plea bargaining and pled guilty. But by that time, it was clear that there were all sorts of problems with the investigation. And I doubted by that time seriously whether James Earl Ray pulled the trigger for lots of reasons. But about I think maybe I met James Earl Ray as early as 69 or 70 when I went to visit him in prison. And I went to visit him as I would visit a convict, a criminal in jail. So that an exact date when that occurred, I cannot tell you. But in visiting with him, I did not get the vibrations from him that he was a racist. I did not sense his language represented the language of hostility. That's what the official account was, that he was just a diehard racist that decided he would kill King. And while I doubted that story by that time, I did decide I had to go see him for myself, find out who he was and what he was about. So I did we connected to each other and had conversations, and I went back to see him once or twice a year, I think, after that. I was living in LA by that time. So I went back to see him once or twice a year, I think. Now, I may have my chronology
Was he finally
messed up.
tried? Did he finally give the trial?
Hmm?
Was there a trial? I know he was.
No, he pled guilty, so there's no trial. There's just a reading into the record what the evidence was and his plea of guilty.
Okay.
That's all. But the very next day, that very same day, he apparently, or the day before, he had written a letter in his own pencil to the judge and said that I am not guilty,
Yes.
and I seek a trial.
Which he never received.
Yeah, the judge read it and collapsed, they say, in a heart attack the same day he wrote the letter. The letter was under him on his desk. He died at his desk.
The judge.
Yeah, the judge. I think the next day or the next day after or something, he collapsed in a heart attack on his office, and the letter was there. And the law at that time for Tennessee was that if a plea bargaining with a capital case told the judge afterwards that I need a trial, that he had a right to a trial. But the state never honored that. The state of Tennessee never honored that. That was always dismissed. He made several pleas through lawyers after that for that trial that the law said he could have, but he never got the trial.
Were you at all involved in what is reopening the case or?
Oh yes, I was involved in investigating the case. I was involved in trying to read all that I could read about the case. I read the entire plea bargaining transcript at one time. After that, I did join with Mark Lane and Dick Gregory, who suspected shenanigans. I did join with them in talking about it. I joined with them in some of the investigations that they did. At the time of the congressional hearing, that was in the 70s, where a select House committee on the assassination of King and Kennedy was established to do an extensive investigation of both killings. And I was interrogated for that hearing, but then declined to testify before the panel, congressional panel, because it was going to be an executive questioning. It was be non-public. The press wasn't going to be there, so I declined it. I declined then to follow up by in the public hearing, and told the committee so that I would not testify when no press was available. For whatever reason, they did some of that. I don't think I ever learned why the time I appeared before the committee, that was made an executive session so that the press was then excluded. I don't know why that happened. I don't remember it.
Well, about the movie script, it says here the young lead in Slay the Dreamer.
Yes.
It's a character named Jeff. Producers have said that the character is a composite of at least two lawyers who worked on the assassination investigation. Did you interact with them, lawyers in real life, before you? Now, you said your testimony. You declined to give testimony because it was
Yeah, it was before the House committee,
for the House committee.
select panel.
Were you involved? So the two lawyers that were involved in this.
I don't remember a lot of this stuff because I'm an active pastor of a sizable church, so I'm engaged in some of this in Memphis while I'm pastor of this sizable congregation that was more than a mouthful.
Okay. Well, and then the
But
father of this,
yes,
the combined lawyer, is based on a real lawyer in Memphis that you knew.
mm-hmm.
can you recall your relationship with him?
Yes, Lucius Birch became my lawyer. He was an outstanding man, poet, scholar, member of the Unitarian Universalist congregation in the city, pilot. He flew his plane downtown to Mud Island to go to his office, which is downtown. He was considered an eccentric. He was also considered a red, a communist, a bad man. But he was a marvelous human being from my encounters with him over many occasions. He was a human rights lawyer, a personal injury lawyer, a criminal lawyer. He combined much of it. He was an old model of a lawyer who did all sorts of cases that were, many of which were on the cutting edges of things. But he was such a great lawyer that he became quite wealthy from it. Especially, I suspect, pushing the insurance companies, because I had a young Navy veteran who had a bad accident. No, he was in the Navy at the time when he was home on leave. I can't even remember the name of the family now, but he was in an accident where he was hit or something and was badly injured. He recovered. The insurance companies told him that he had no claims. I took him to the Birch firm and introduced him to Lucius Birch, who took the case. Because oftentimes insurance companies would not pay off ordinary citizens when they had responsibility for the claim. That was in the 60s, and so the Birch firm took up that case. And in fact, I don't know the history of this, but they made it possible for black claimants, poor people claimants, they went to court enough that they got insurance companies to play fairly with ordinary people who had no resources. So in that sense, that firm flourished, as far as I remember, because they would take these cases and successfully ran them through the court, got them through the court, and got the people the claims for injury and whatnot, mayhem.
Okay, and one of the last questions he has is, virtually all the characters depicted in the script are real people. Grace Walden, Charlie Stevens, Solomon Jones, Arthur Murtaugh, Dick Gregory, and J. Edgar Hoover. He knew all these people?
Yes, except J. Edgar Hoover, who I only knew from the press and from reading.
Now, you've read the script?
I didn't know that Stevens, the male.
Okay.
I did meet Grace. Solomon Jones was a chauffeur. He was at the motel to pick up King and King's party to take them to the dinner that night, that 6 o'clock. He was on the ground floor. He was never interrogated by the police about what he saw or what he heard. He was there when the shot came. He was one of those witnesses in the motel and on the ground floor on the motel who heard the shot and looked in the direction of it and saw that the shot had come from the high weeds on the hillside, not from the boarding house, as the official story portrayed. That it came, if the official boarding house is here on Main Street, the big lot separating it from the motel, other buildings here to the corner, the shot came from here, not from here. And a number of witnesses saw that. They saw the weeds. At least one, as I recall, said that he saw a figure in the weeds, the high weeds, brush. The city had the brush all cut down the very next morning. So a crime scene was tampered with. So there were other witnesses. Solomon, that's who Solomon Jones was. Grace Walden was the witness in the boarding house. She was a roomer, I think something of a long-term roomer, with her common law husband, whose name's there, who I do not remember meeting. And Grace saw the man who ran down the steps. Her apartment it was facing the staircase in some fashion. So when she had the door open, and I think she had the door open knitting that Thursday afternoon and evening, and she saw the man who came running down the staircase. The script is based upon an actual fact. The police took the photo of James Earl Ray to her, and she said it wasn't the man I saw coming down the step. And I had a good view of the man's body and face. That was not the man. They tried to persuade her that this was the man. Now, this is from her own testimony. And the testimony is in the public record, in the lawyer's record. She said it wasn't. They offered her the reward of $100,000 was put up for lead to the killer of the Martin Luther King Jr. She said no.
What about the rest of the characters, as far as how accurate are they being portrayed in the script?
I haven't read the script for 15 years,
Oh,
Eric.
okay.
I've got to reread it.
I understand.
And it's been changed in various ways.
Okay.
But as I remember reading it 20 years ago, and I think I read it again 10 years ago, it was a very accurate description of the incident that they write about. She ends up in a West Tennessee mental hospital. And the story is about how then the lawyer working with a pastor and the pastor working with lawyers got her out of the mental hospital. That's, I think, the plot.
Okay.
And she did get out of the hospital. I saw her a couple of times after that.
Okay.
And that was during the time when Mark Lane and Dick Gregory were doing continued investigation. And Mark Lane became her lawyer. I don't know what year this was, but Mark Lane became her lawyer and helped her in her last years of life in various ways.
Okay. Also, Elizabeth, let me ask you, speak a little bit about Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, and I guess it's Solomon Jones, which you already spoke of, that were seen at the assassination, and what, okay, you talked about Solomon Jones, but Andrew Young and Jesse Jackson.
Yes, Andrew Young and Jesse Jackson were both in the motel courtyard when the shot was fired. Andy immediately ran up the steps, and there's a famous picture in the books with Andy and 2 or 3 others pointing to where they thought the shot came from and to where the smoke was in the weeds.
Right.
Andy, to my knowledge, was never interrogated by the FBI or the local police about what he saw.
What about Reverend Jackson?
Jesse Jackson was on the ground. He was involved in the conversation with King and 1 or 2 others, King on the balcony. Jesse Jackson was there. He's never been interrogated, so he's not in the official record of what he heard and saw. So that's part of the whole business of doubt about the thoroughness of the investigation.
Yes, I can understand that, not questioning witnesses. And you talked about Grace Walton a little bit. You don't have any idea who had her committed, or?
No, I don't remember that at all.
Okay.
How they did it, I don't know. I don't remember the details.
Okay. And finally,
Mm-hmm.
finally to the end. Why do you think it is important for Slay the Dreamer to be made as a film?
Well, first of all, it is an example of a film where a very specific historic incident is used as a basis to simply raise questions and to get people to do some talking, looking at a historical event of an assassination and recognize that there are all kinds of problems with the official story.
Do you think that there's going to be you think maybe it'll spark a reopening investigation?
No, I don't have any such ambitions. I just think it's a good story. It makes a good story.
Okay.
It should make a good film.
Okay.
It ought to be made public. Let people see it.